The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming on the hood of a worn gray coat as Grace Bennett stood at the imposing gates of the Whitmore estate. Her hair, once golden and full of life, clung in wet strands to her pale cheeks. Clutched against her chest was her daughter Daisy. Small, shivering, her tiny fingers curled tightly around a wooden beaded bracelet that seemed far too precious for a child dressed in hand-me-down clothes. Pressing the intercom button, Grace took a shaky breath. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want charity. I'll clean your house for a plate of food for my daughter." Inside, Edward Whitmore, the 38-year-old CEO of a real estate empire, watched the rain-streaked image on the security monitor. His expression was unreadable until his eyes fell on Daisy's bracelet. It was identical to the one he had once given his late daughter, Clara, before the accident that had taken her from him. His hand froze on the console, his chest tightening with a familiar ache he thought he'd buried years ago. Without another word, he pressed the button that swung the gates open. Grace stepped into the grand hall, her shoes squelching on the marble floor, her clothes dripping from the storm. Daisy's cheeks were pale, her eyes wide with the cautious watchfulness of a child who had seen too much. Edward studied them both, his tone clipped. "What do you want?" Grace straightened, drenched but resolute. "A meal for my daughter. I'll do any work you need, just a meal." Something shifted in Edward's gaze as thunder rolled overhead. He stepped aside. "Enter. The child needs to eat." Grace was shown to a modest guest suite, its warmth a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Moments later, she found a neatly folded bundle outside the door, soft socks, a sweater, and trousers for Daisy. There was no note, only the quiet act itself. She dressed her daughter in the dry clothes, fed her the warm broth that appeared soon after, and tucked her into bed, whispering her thanks into the dim light. Upstairs in his private study, Edward sat with a framed photograph of Clara. The sight of Daisy's bracelet had cracked open something he had fought to keep sealed. In the stillness of the night, the mansion seemed less like a fortress of stone and more like a place haunted by the echoes of a child's laughter. Grace didn't know why the man had let them in, nor why he had shown them such unspoken kindness. But as Daisy's breathing steadied in sleep and the storm raged outside, both mother and daughter had found something they hadn't felt in far too long: safety. Neither of them could know that this uneasy truce, born of hunger, grief, and a chance meeting in the rain, was about to change all three of their lives forever. 2 days had passed since Grace Bennett had first arrived at the Whitmore estate, cradling Daisy against the storm. In that short span, the vast echoing halls had begun to feel less like a stranger's fortress and more like a fragile refuge. Grace had not asked to stay longer. Instead, she quietly earned their place by scrubbing, dusting, and polishing from dawn until the soft hum of the evening settled over the house. Edward Whitmore spoke little, moving like a shadow through the corridors. His presence felt more than seen. Yet there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the carefully maintained distance between them seemed to waver. Daisy, with her bright, curious eyes and the beaded bracelet forever clinging to her small wrist, had an uncanny way of noticing the invisible. "It's the man with the sad voice," she whispered to Grace one morning, tugging at her sleeve as Edward passed through the foyer. Mortified, Grace apologized, but Edward only paused, his gaze resting on Daisy a fraction longer than politeness required, before murmuring, "Children often notice what adults ignore," and disappearing into the library. That night, while Daisy slept in the oversized guest bed, Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, mending a tear in her daughter's only warm jacket. The lamplight caught in her hair, turning damp strands into threads of gold. She thought of the van they had lived in mere weeks ago, how she had wrapped Daisy in layers of worn sweaters and sung to her over the distant rumble of lorries passing through the petrol station car park. She had survived worse, she told herself. Yet this strange sense of security unsettled her more than any hardship. As she set the jacket aside, her eyes fell on the nightstand. There, as if by magic, sat a tray with a cup of warm milk and 3 shortbread biscuits. She hadn't heard anyone enter. She touched the cup. It was still warm, and a lump rose in her throat. Edward's gestures were always like this, quiet, without fanfare, without the need for thanks. The next morning brought another small surprise. As Grace swept the kitchen floor, Daisy sat at the breakfast nook, coloring with a set of old crayons she hadn't seen before. "Where did you get these?" Grace asked, and Daisy simply pointed to the counter. Edward entered moments later, nodded briefly, and left again, phone pressed to his ear. Grace couldn't remember the last time someone had given her daughter something without expecting anything in return. Upstairs in his study, Edward turned the beaded bracelet over in his fingers, listening to the faint echo of Daisy's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. He hadn't heard that sound in 4 years. Not since Clara. That afternoon, Grace's cleaning carried her to the upper landing, where a door she hadn't noticed before stood ajar. Inside was a nursery, untouched for years, its lilac walls faded but still bright with painted clouds. On the bed lay a small blue pillow with a seam split open. Without thinking, Grace picked it up, intending to mend it. She didn't hear Edward's footsteps until his voice cut through the stillness, sharper than she had ever heard it. "What are you doing?" She turned, startled, clutching the pillow. "It was torn. I was just going to fix it." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be in here." Grace lowered her gaze, setting the pillow back gently. "I didn't know. I only meant to help." That night, after the house fell silent, Edward returned to the nursery. The pillow was neatly sewn, a note resting on top. "I'm sorry for touching something sacred. I only meant to help." His fingers traced the even stitches, and for the first time in years he felt tears slip down his cheeks, silent, unbidden, but not unwelcome. Downstairs Grace paced, wondering if she had overstepped beyond repair. Yet the next morning Edward appeared in the kitchen doorway, his voice low but steady. "I have more rooms that could use cleaning if you're willing to stay another week." Surprised, Grace nodded. "Of course, thank you." His eyes flicked toward Daisy, who was sipping her cereal milk. "It's easier having someone in the house," he said, more to himself than to her. "She makes it feel like it used to." And though no one spoke it aloud, something had shifted. Something small, tentative, but real. For the first time in years, the mansion was not just a monument to loss. It was beginning very quietly to live again. The garden had always been Edward Whitmore's least favorite place since Clara's passing. A once carefully kept sanctuary now surrendered to ivy, tangled roses, and the gentle chaos of wildflowers that grew wherever the wind willed. It had been Clara's pride, a place where she would spend hours chasing butterflies or crouching by the fountain she had named the Whispering Water. Edward had avoided it for years, unwilling to face the hollow quiet that had replaced her laughter. But that morning, stepping out in search of fresh air he didn't truly expect to find, he saw something that stopped him mid-stride. Daisy stood barefoot in the grass, her small frame haloed by sunlight as she stretched her arms toward the low branch of an old apple tree. Her tiny fingers reached, failed, and reached again. For a moment Edward hesitated at the edge of the patio, almost turning back. But something about her quiet determination drew him forward. Without a word he stepped beside her, plucked the reddest apple from the branch and held it out. Her eyes widened with delight as she took it, and then, in the way children do when they act entirely from the heart, she wrapped her arms around his legs and rested her head against his knee. "Thank you, Mr. Sad Voice," she murmured softly. The name caught him off guard, but before he could respond, Emily appeared on the porch, breathless and flustered. "I'm so sorry," she called, hurrying down the steps to retrieve her daughter. She likes to give people names." Edward looked from the apple in Daisy's hand to the worry in Emily's eyes. "It's all right," he said quietly. His voice, though low, held no trace of annoyance. Emily hesitated, then added shyly, "She says your voice sounds like someone missing a song. I told her some people carry quiet in their hearts." For a moment, Edward couldn't speak. He only nodded, watching as Emily led Daisy back toward the house, the child clutching her apple like treasure. Later that afternoon, while Daisy napped upstairs, Grace peeled potatoes at the kitchen counter. Edward lingered nearby, for once not retreating into his study. "Before all this," she began, her voice casual but tinged with something heavier, "I worked in a nursing home, night shifts. I liked listening to the residents talk about the past." He asked quietly, "What happened?" She stilled for a moment, then resumed peeling. A supervisor started cornering me, saying things he shouldn't. I reported it, but they said I made it up. I walked out that day. There was a pause. And Daisy's father? Edward asked gently. Left when I was 3 months pregnant, she said simply. Never called. Never looked back. Daisy was born in the back seat of our van. The first thing she did was scream loud and strong. That sound kept me going. Edward studied her as she sliced the last potato, her movements steady, unflinching. You're stronger than you realize, he said softly. That evening the rain returned, not the violent downpour of the night they had arrived, but a soft, steady drizzle that tapped gently against the windows. Emily and Daisy curled together on the living room sofa under a knitted blanket, the crackle of the fireplace filling the quiet. Daisy's small form was tucked into the curve of her mother's arm, her breathing slow and even. Emily, though her eyes were closed, held her daughter with the kind of protective looseness that says, I will wake if you so much as stir. Edward came downstairs for a glass of water, but stopped at the sight before him. He didn't move closer. He simply stood in the shadowed hallway, watching. The glow of the fire outlined their shapes in gold, and for the first time in years the scene before him didn't hurt. It ached, yes, but in a way that felt alive, not hollow. He turned off the hallway light so it wouldn't wake them and slipped quietly back upstairs. Lying in bed, Edward couldn't escape the image of Daisy's little hand tangled in Emily's jumper, the way her head had rested trustingly against her mother's side. It stirred something dangerous in him, something he had fought for years to keep buried. Caring was a risk, and love was a wound he had never fully survived. But as he closed his eyes, he found himself thinking of Daisy's laughter in the garden, Emily's steady voice as she spoke of her past, and the quiet safety they brought to rooms that had once been tombs. For the first time since Clara's death, sleep came not as an escape from his memories, but as a place where new ones might be made, and where laughter might follow him into dreams again. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in with a sky the color of tarnished silver, the wind thick with the smell of rain. By early evening, the Thorne estate was wrapped in the low rumble of distant thunder, the windows streaked with relentless downpour. Inside, the lights glowed warmly, until at precisely 7:08 p.m. the house went dark. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, the faint buzz of electricity vanished, and the security lights outside blinked into nothing. In the silence, a small gasp broke through. "Mummy?" Daisy's voice trembled, her little hands gripping the edge of the blanket she'd been wrapped in. Grace, standing in the kitchen with a torch she had just retrieved from a drawer, forced a calm she didn't quite feel. "Looks like we're having a candle-lit evening, darling," she said lightly. Daisy clapped her hands as if it were an adventure, the sudden dark turning into a game in her mind. Within minutes, Grace had set 3 thick candles on the coffee table, their flames dancing against the glass, painting the living room in soft gold. She pulled Daisy onto the rug beside her, the knitted blanket wrapped snugly around them both. Edward appeared in the doorway, a tall shadow holding a worn book of poetry in one hand. He hesitated, unsure if he belonged in this intimate, fire-warmed circle. Grace looked up and patted the space beside her. "Come on," she teased. "We don't bite." A faint chuckle escaped him as he lowered himself stiffly onto the floor. In the flicker of candlelight, the sharp edges of his face seemed to soften, the deep lines carved by years of grief almost melting away. "Tell us a story, Mummy," Daisy chirped, eyes wide and expectant. Grace leaned back, smiling playfully. "All right. Once upon a time there was a little hedgehog who wanted to fly." She launched into a wildly exaggerated tale of a hedgehog who tied leaves to his back to make wings, her voice full of dramatic pauses and silly sound effects. Daisy dissolved into giggles, clutching her sides. She squealed when her mother mimed the hedgehog flapping awkwardly, falling over and rolling down a hill. Edward sat still, watching Daisy's laughter bloom in the flickering light. It was not just the sound that undid him, it was the shape of it, the tiny gasp between giggles, the crinkle of her nose, the way her head tipped back in unguarded joy. It was exactly how Clara had laughed. His hands began to tremble before he realized it, and when Grace glanced over, her smile faded. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He blinked, realizing too late that tears had already spilled down his cheeks. He looked away, voice breaking. "I haven't heard that sound in 4 years." There was a pause, the rain filling the silence. "My daughter," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Her name was Clara. She was 5. She died in a car accident. I was in another country at a meeting. I wasn't there." Grace's eyes softened, her own voice low. "I'm so sorry." He exhaled slowly, as though the weight of the confession had been locked inside him for too long. "I've tried," he said, his words rough, "to bury it, to work until I can't feel anything. But sometimes I see Daisy and it's like I'm drowning all over again." Grace didn't reach for him, but she shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his. "Do you think," she asked gently, "that pain ever really leaves? Or does it just need someone willing to carry a piece of it with you?" Edward turned to her then, really seeing her, not as a struggling single mother he'd allowed into his home, but as a woman who understood what it meant to lose something irreplaceable and still choose love anyway. The rain pattered steadily on the roof, the only sound between them for a long time. Grace's eyes reflected the candlelight, warm but unwavering. Later, after she had drifted to sleep on the couch, Daisy curled against her side, Edward stood quietly and draped a wool blanket over them both. His hand lingered for a moment on the edge of the blanket before he stepped back into the hallway shadows. That night, as he lay in bed, Edward realized the strangest thing. He no longer feared the dreams. For years they had been filled with loss, replaying the accident, the empty nursery, the sound of silence pressing in on him. But now, uninvited yet welcome, new images had begun to slip in. Daisy's laughter in candlelight, Grace's voice telling stories, the steady rhythm of rain that didn't feel lonely anymore. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes not to escape his reality, but to remember it. And somewhere between the memories of Clara and the life now slowly unfurling in his home, he began to imagine what it might feel like to live again. The scandal hit like a lightning strike, sudden and blinding. It began with a grainy photograph and a cheap headline plastered across a gossip blog. "Billionaire CEO playing house with homeless maid." By morning, it had spread across every major outlet, the story twisting into something ugly. Reporters gathered like vultures outside the iron gates of the Thorne estate, cameras flashing, voices shouting through the bars. Grace stood behind the living room curtain, her heart pounding as she pulled Daisy into her arms. The child clung to her, wide-eyed, frightened by the chaos beyond the glass. She could hear the questions being hurled into the storm. "Is it true she lived in a van? Did you take her in out of pity, Mr. Thorne? Is the child yours?" Each word landed like a blow. Daisy buried her face in her mother's sweater, trembling. Grace didn't know what to do except hold her tighter, wishing she could shield her from the whole world. And then Edward stepped outside. He walked straight to the gates, his face calm but his eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness. When the reporters pounced, he didn't flinch. "This woman," he said clearly, his voice carrying over the noise, "is the reason my daughter smiles again. She is the reason I remember how to breathe. If any of you ever call her a gold digger again, you will be hearing from my lawyers." The crowd stilled for a heartbeat, caught off guard by his words. Grace, watching from inside, felt the air catch in her lungs. She had expected him to be angry, maybe even to distance himself from her for the sake of his reputation. But this was a shield, a public declaration, and it left her momentarily speechless. That afternoon the house was quieter, but the tension remained. Edward's oldest friend, Daniel Mercer, arrived unannounced, breezing into the kitchen like he'd been doing it all his life. "You look different," Daniel remarked as Edward joined him in the study. "That bad?" Edward asked with a wry smile. "No," Daniel said, studying him. "That alive?" The fire crackled between them as Daniel glanced at the candle on Edward's desk and the open notebook filled with Lily's drawings. "So she did it," Daniel murmured. "She got through." Edward stared into the flames. "I didn't plan for this. I thought letting them stay was temporary. But now," Daisy laughs, and I swear I hear Lily in every sound. Grace looks at me like I'm not broken, and I want to be the man she thinks I am. Daniel leaned back, his expression softening. Then be him. Lily's gone, Edward, but you're not. You get to choose if her memory becomes your anchor or your wings. The words lingered long after Daniel left. That evening, while Daisy napped upstairs, Edward found Grace folding laundry in the guest room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked up, startled but calm, as he stepped forward with a small wooden box in his hands. "I wanted to give you this," he said quietly. She took it, her fingers brushing his. Inside was a thin, faded children's book, the cover worn smooth, the title almost erased, The Adventures of Pinecone Bunny. "It was Lily's favorite," Edward said, his voice thick. "She made me read it every night, even when she memorized every word." Grace traced the spine gently. "Rosie will love it," she whispered. Edward hesitated, then admitted, "You remind me of her, of Lily. You love Daisy the same way I loved her, maybe even more." Grace's gaze dropped for a moment before she asked softly, "Sometimes I wonder, am I just a replacement for the life you lost?" Edward's expression shifted, the walls he so often carried around himself falling away. "You're not," he said simply, the truth plain in his eyes. She closed the box slowly, their fingers brushing again, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding that went deeper than gratitude or circumstance. Outside, the last of the reporters had left. The estate was still, the air no longer heavy with intrusion, and though no declarations were made, though no promises were spoken aloud, something had shifted. Not love, at least not yet, but the start of it. Something fragile, but alive, taking root in the cracks left by loss. Edward didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, he found he wasn't afraid to see. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches of the willow tree, scattering soft, dappled shadows across the manicured lawn of the Thorne estate. A checkered picnic blanket lay spread beneath a towering oak, littered with crumbs from sandwiches and bright plastic cups half filled with lemonade. Daisy's laughter floated through the air like the purest melody, chasing the last remnants of silence that had once haunted these grounds. She darted barefoot across the grass, her small hands reaching for bubbles drifting lazily on the breeze. Grace sat on the blanket, hair tumbling loose in the golden light, her bare toes curling into the warm fabric as she sipped from a glass and watched her daughter. Edward sat a few feet away, leaning back on his hands, eyes fixed on the two of them with an expression he didn't even try to hide anymore. Picnics had never been his thing before. They always felt staged, the kind of family moments he'd seen in other people's lives but never truly felt. Yet here, surrounded by imperfect laughter, wobbly running, and a hint of chaos, everything felt real, dangerously, beautifully real. "Careful, Daisy!" Grace called as her daughter veered toward the stone path that cut through the garden. But the warning came a heartbeat too late. Daisy's tiny foot caught the edge, sending her tumbling forward. She hit the ground with a sharp cry, scraping her palms and knees on the rough stone. Grace shot up instantly, her heart leaping into her throat. But Edward was already moving. He reached her in seconds, scooping her up with a gentleness that spoke of instinct rather than thought. Hey, it's okay, sweetheart, I've got you," he murmured, brushing dirt from her skin. Daisy clung to him, her little chest hitching with sobs, her face buried in his shirt. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. Through her tears, Daisy's trembling voice broke the air. "Daddy!" One word, small, fragile, but heavy enough to stop time. Edward froze, his arms tightening around her as though afraid she might vanish. Grace, halfway toward them, halted in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. She had never heard Daisy call anyone that before. Edward lowered himself to his knees on the grass, holding her closer, his cheek pressed against her hair. He didn't correct her. He didn't speak at all, just stayed there, absorbing the sound of that word like it was the first drop of rain after a long drought. Slowly his eyes began to glisten, and though no sobs escaped, the quiet tears told their own story. When Grace finally reached them, she knelt beside them, her voice soft. "She's never called anyone that," she said, as if to reassure him she understood the weight of it. Edward looked at her, his voice raw when he spoke. "I didn't expect to feel this much." Grace met his gaze steadily. "Edward, do you want to be part of our lives?" Not as someone fixing the past, but as someone building a future? He didn't hesitate. He nodded, his voice firm. I do. Later that evening, as the estate settled into its usual calm, Grace found a single flower resting on the dining table, a delicate purple orchid, Lily's favorite. There was no note, no grand gesture, just the bloom itself, vivid against the polished wood. Grace picked it up carefully, her fingertips brushing the petals. She didn't need to ask what it meant. It was a promise, unspoken but certain. When she looked up, Edward was standing in the doorway watching her. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Their eyes held long enough for the air between them to change, something wordless and steady forming in the silence. She smiled faintly, tucking the flower into a small vase, and in that moment she knew that whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, it wasn't fleeting. That night, as Daisy slept soundly in her bed, her scraped hands cleaned and knees bandaged, Edward sat in the living room opposite Grace. The fire was low, casting an amber glow over them. Without overthinking, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. I don't want you to leave, he said quietly. Ever. Grace's breath caught, not because she hadn't hoped for those words, but because of the way he said them, steady, without condition. And when people start asking questions again, she asked cautiously, when the world wants to know who I am to you? Edward didn't look away. They'll know you're the woman I trust, the one who saved my life. Grace exhaled slowly, her thumb brushing over his hand. Then we stay. His lips curved into the faintest smile. Oh, for always if you want. The Thorne estate, once an echoing monument to silence and grief, had softened over the passing months. Its grand halls, once cold and untouchable, now carried the warm hum of life, morning laughter spilling from the kitchen, Daisy's hurried footsteps on the polished floors, the faint strains of music drifting through open doors. For Edward, the changes felt almost unreal. Not long ago, the idea of sharing his home, let alone his heart, had seemed impossible. Now every small sound felt like a thread stitching him back together. That morning, Grace stood by the front door, her hair neatly pinned back, a stack of nursing textbooks tucked under her arm. She looked different, more sure of herself, yet still carrying that quiet humility he had first seen in her. Orientation starts at 10, she said, her tone a mixture of nerves and excitement. Edward leaned against the doorframe, a mug of coffee in hand, his eyes holding hers. You'll be brilliant, he said simply, no trace of doubt in his voice. They're lucky to have you. She gave him a smile, small but warm, and kissed his cheek before stepping outside. Daisy came running a moment later, her little backpack bouncing, a pen clutched in her hand. Mama forgot her lucky pen, she giggled, holding it up triumphantly. Grace laughed, scooped her up, and spun her in the air before taking it. Edward watched them from the porch, his chest full in a way he still didn't quite know how to explain. Inside, the living room told its own story. Gone were the rigid floral arrangements and untouched corners that had made the space feel like a museum. In their place stood a bright play tent by the window, shelves lined with children's books, and on the center wall, a framed piece of Daisy's artwork. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright blue sky, one tall, one in a dress, and one small with curls. Above them, written in bold, uneven letters, was a single word: family. Edward had framed it himself, not telling Grace until she spotted it one afternoon and stood frozen in place. Her hand brushed his as she whispered, "Thank you." He hadn't replied. Her expression had been enough. One rainy afternoon, they sat together in the garden, sheltered under a large patio umbrella while Daisy danced barefoot on the wet stones. The rain made the air smell fresh, the kind of scent that seemed to promise new beginnings. Edward's gaze followed Daisy as she twirled, her laughter bubbling into the drizzle. "I used to dread the rain," he murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. Grace turned her head toward him. "And now?" He watched Daisy spin in circles, her arms stretched out like wings. "Now it feels like a second chance," he said. Grace rested her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "I spent years fearing the next goodbye. Now, I believe in tomorrows again." They didn't need more words. The rain filled the silence, washing away the weight of their pasts, at least for that moment. Later that evening, after dinner, Daisy climbed onto Edward's lap, a worn photo album in her small hands. "Tell me again," she said, flipping to a picture. Edward smiled faintly. "That was your first day at the zoo," he began. "You fed the goats and screamed when one licked your hand." Daisy squealed in laughter, burying her face in his chest. "You're the best, Daddy," she said, her voice muffled against him. He closed his eyes briefly, his arms tightening around her. "I had the best teacher," he whispered, though she was too busy giggling to hear the weight in his words. That night, after tucking Daisy into bed, Edward wandered into the garden alone. The flowers Grace had planted were thriving, adding bursts of color to the once neglected grounds. Near the fountain, a small cluster of purple orchids bloomed, Lily's favorite. He crouched beside them, running his fingers gently over the petals. "Hi, Lily," he murmured, his voice catching slightly. "I hope you like the garden." For a long moment he stayed there, letting the cool evening air settle around him. When he finally returned to the house, Grace was standing barefoot in the doorway, the warm glow of the lights behind her. She reached out her hand, and without a word, he took it. "We're home, aren't we?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his life on a stormy night and somehow turned his grief into something living again, and nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice certain. "We finally are." The seasons shifted quietly around Thorn Estate, each day blending into the next, not in monotony, but in the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. Edward had once measured time by business meetings and property acquisitions. Now it was marked by Daisy's laughter in the garden, the smell of Grace's cooking drifting from the kitchen, and the soft weight of a little hand slipping into his when they crossed the lawn. One evening, as the last of the daylight poured gold across the orchard, Edward stood on the terrace watching Grace and Daisy gather wildflowers. Daisy's voice carried across the breeze, bright, unafraid, alive. Grace looked up, catching his gaze, and for a moment the world seemed perfectly still. He realized then that what had grown between them wasn't born out of pity, nor was it a replacement for what had been lost. It was something entirely new, rooted in trust, watered with patience, and nurtured by the quiet decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. Later, as they sat together on the old garden bench, Daisy curled up between them, Edward found himself saying the words he had been holding back. "I never thought I'd have a family again," he said softly. Grace looked at him, her eyes warm in the fading light. "Families aren't always made the way we expect," she replied. "Sometimes they find us when we're not looking." Daisy, half asleep, mumbled, "We're forever now, right?" Edward smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart, we're forever." That night, as rain began to fall gently against the windows, Edward stood in the doorway of Daisy's room, watching her sleep. Grace joined him, her hand finding his. "We've both lost before," she whispered, "but maybe that's why we can love like this now." Edward nodded, realizing that pain never truly vanishes. It simply changes shape when shared. And in this home, with these two souls, his grief had softened into something almost unrecognizable. Something like peace. Life lesson. Sometimes the greatest second chances don't arrive with fanfare. They come quietly in the form of people who see you at your lowest and stay anyway. Love doesn't erase the past, but it can make the weight of it easier to carry. If you've been hurt, don't close your heart forever, because one day someone might walk in, not to fix what's broken, but to help you build something new.